to a special two-part EWTN bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. First up is Terry Beatley, author of What If We've Been Wrong, published by Guiding Light Books. In the second part of our program, it's Father Terrence Ehrman, Man of God. But first up, Terry Beatley, great to see you.
Thank you, Doug.
Have you here. People might have seen you on Jim and Joy's program talking about this. The whole title is What If We've Been Wrong? Keeping My Promise to America's Abortion King. Now, somebody might want to know, why do you feel obligated to keep a promise to an abortion king, and who are you talking about?
Well, who am I talking about? I'm talking about Dr. Bernard Nathanson. As many of your listeners may or may not know, he was the father of the modern-day abortion industry in America, who ultimately became Catholic in 1996. He's a modern-day, what I call that Saul Paul story. And he's left behind his legacy. And so about why keep the promise, because I made him a promise on December 1st, 2009. I had the rare opportunity to go interview him in Manhattan, New York. He was 83 years old, terminally ill with cancer. And at the end of the interview, I said, Dr. Nathanson, do you have a message for America? And he said, yes. And he gave me this, and I promised him I would deliver this across our country.
When you say he gave you this, or a message, I mean, he wrote the book for you, he gave you some insights, you did a long-form interview. What do you mean? Now,
I met with him for about an hour. Again, he was very, very ill, 83. He knew the culture he was leaving behind, this culture of death, as we are, we're immersed in, and as well as sexual hedonism. And Dr. Nathanson called himself the keeper of the abortion industry keys. And so what I say is to unlock his legacy, because most Catholics, most Americans don't know the legacy of Dr. Bernard Nathanson. So the analogy I make is, if you want to understand the American Revolutionary War, you can't understand it without studying George Washington. To understand how we ended up aborting 60 million babies, you have to understand Dr. Bernard Nathanson's story.
Right, and what you show here, and you talk about Father C. John McCloskey, who was the one who brought him into the church. He was kind of the John the Baptist for many
and he wrote
prominent
the foreword.
Catholics. He wrote the foreword here, and he talks about, it was no stranger to him. Nathanson knew him. He brought him into the church in '96, and he made the point in the forward here that Terry proves that to make our country great again, it begins by admitting our errors and elevating the dignity of all lives, not just some chosen by the few. Without question, Dr. Nathanson's saga and message can help resensitize the heart of America. And he went on to say, I agree with Terry that if Americans, particularly Catholics, Protestant, evangelicals, people without any faith at all, would learn of Dr. Nathanson's strategy of deception and then respond to his parting message, the future of America will be much brighter. What was the strategy of deception?
Okay, there are 8 points of propaganda that Dr. Nathanson used beginning back in the late 1960s into the early 70s, and they're still in existence today. The first one was he framed everything around, well, they were the first ones out of the gate, this idea of choice, right? Then they came up with the slogans that we hear today. They're so commonplace. Then we don't have enough time to get into all of them, but then he promoted false statistics, false facts. He would say, look, 1 million women a year are having back alley abortions. Well, the real number was, no, it wasn't 1 million. It was about, at the high side, 100,000. He would tell the media that 5,000 to 10,000 women a year were dying of illegal abortions.
Back alley stuff.
Back alley abortions, coat hanger abortions, and all that. That was a bald-faced lie. The real number, at the very most, was 200 to 250 women a year. And so,
which is horrible. We all admit that.
Absolutely. It's horrible. I mean, they are choosing an illegal activity and then ultimately resulting in death of 2 people, baby and mother. Everything was based on lies and propaganda. He used the complicit media. They would repeat the lies to the complicit media. But the big kahuna was the 8th point, called the Catholic strategy.
Which you document in the book.
I do. I go into great detail in the book. But in a nutshell, it was 4 parts of the Catholic strategy to deceive Catholics so that they wanted to make sure they could get enough Catholics who were personally against abortion willing to support pro-abortion candidates. Because we have to face it as Catholics, that the umbilical cord for the abortion industry is political. That is their lifeblood. And Dr. Nathanson, he left an amazing quote. He said that he believed the abortion ethic is fatally and forever flawed by the immorality of the means of its victory. A political victory achieved by such odious tactics is at best an unstable tyranny. But the end justifies
the means for people like that, right?
Exactly. Well, he had partnered with 2 communists, 2 Marxists, and that is the Marxist worldview. If to get from point A to point B, to legalize abortion, decriminalize it, if it took lying to get from point A to point B, that's okay, as long as they can get to point B.
Right.
But now we live in a culture with millions of hurt men, hurt women, and this culture of death, and it's time to get the facts straight.
And of course, even you talk about here, and kind of have been promoted with Jane Roe, who ultimately has died, but who became a Catholic, about the whole thing, the whole case was a lie.
Well, the entire, when that's one of the blessings of this book, and it's more than just talk about it. God connected me with Sam Casey and Alan Parker. Alan Parker and Sam wrote the appendix in the book called Assumicide, the 6 Erroneous Assumptions of Roe v. Wade. Because most people, let's face it, aren't going to read an academic thick book on the history of Roe v. Wade, but they will read a summary. And that's why we want people to go to EWTN bookstore, get the book, and because you can not only you get the updated story on Nathanson, you get his personal parting message that he gave me. You learn the 8 parts of the strategy, including the Catholic strategy.
Are we still seeing that strategy ongoing
Absolutely.
today, or is it morphed into some other new strategies, or what do you see?
Oh, it's that. Well, what they did in to get abortion decriminalized, the Marxist left have utilized the identical strategy to legalize homosexual marriage. The platform is the same. But as far as the lies are still in existence, all of the lies that Dr. Nathanson left behind, they're all in existence today. He wanted Americans, particularly American Catholics, to know the truth. My goal is not to teach 25,000 Catholics. My goal is I want every American Catholic to know what Dr. Nathanson left behind. If just Catholics would know the truth, learn American history, we will crush the abortion industry. Because and part of his message was, love one another. Abortion's not love. Stop the killing. The world needs more love, and that he was all about love now.
And in chapter 14, which is the few perfidious priests and the Catholic strategy, which we can focus on in our limited time, there's a quote here right on the bottom from Nathanson's The Abortion Papers. The church helped us in NARAL. We used them with great effect. And he goes on here in the book, you say it was their cunning strategy. And the quote here, dealing with the Kennedys from the early 60s, intentional, systematic, concerted effort on the part of a group of dissenting Catholic theologians. Some of us might remember these names: Father Richard McCormick, Charles Curran, Bob Drinan, John Courtney Murray, who spent a good deal of time with the Kennedys in the 60s employing the bogus moral theory arguments, convinced that they could accept and promote abortion with a clear conscience.
Right. And if American Catholics, I want to remove this from political parties and all this stuff. We just need to know our history. NARAL used Catholics to advance the culture of death onto America. I'm a Catholic revert, and I did not revert back to the Catholic Church to just sit back and watch 50% of Catholics just act like abortion is just one more issue.
Is that the Catholic straddle?
Well, the Catholic straddle is, Nathanson knew, NARAL knew they wouldn't be able to get all Catholics to rah-rah support abortion. They wanted to make sure they could get enough voting Catholics to, it's okay, they would say it's okay to remain personally abhorrent toward abortion, but every woman deserves the right to choose.
The Mario Cuomo speech in Notre Dame. I'm personally opposed.
Absolutely. But what Catholics need to understand, all those umpteen grandchildren that they have, if we don't catch on to what NARAL did politically to this country, to Catholics, it's game over. We've already lost parental rights in almost all 50 states. I mean, there's a judicial bypass, if I'm not mistaken now, in all 50 states. That means even if they've got on the books, like in the state of Virginia, that you have to have the parental consent or knowledge, no, that's not the truth. That they've got this thing so rigged now that girl can go behind her parents' back to a liberal judge, and that judge can grant her an abortion if he thinks she's mature enough to handle it. That's a surgery, and that's wrong.
Well, it's interesting you say, I listened to his condensed version of the Catholic strategy and how they took a page right out of Margaret Sanger's marketing manual on how she spread the cultural acceptance of contraception and eugenics on a national scale.
Yeah, well, Margaret Sanger, Margaret, it was interesting, if you really understand the history of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger did not go after the Catholic Church out of the box. She knew she couldn't back then convince the Catholic Church to start contracepting. So she diverted and she went first to Protestants. So we're actually dealing with, I call it the 100-year curse of Margaret Sanger. Because I mean, this whole thing about Planned Parenthood, it's not women's health care. It's her gospel of spreading eugenics, population control, and the doctrine of promiscuity. Nathanson, once her doctrine piggybacked with Dr. Alfred Kinsey, which I highlight in here.
Right,
Nathanson was just there. He was like the cherry on top. What do we do now with all this promiscuity and all these unwanted babies? Let's kill them.
And it's also interesting because you point out, was it an early relationship Nathanson had with a woman where he procured an abortion for her, right?
That's right. And that's what I cover in the book is Nathanson grew up not understanding what does love look like.
Yeah, in a Jewish family, but his father hated religion or something.
Yeah, he was an atheist. He was an atheist
right.
Jewish man, and Nathanson had never experienced unconditional love. He didn't understand that concept, so he met a woman back in college. He said it's the first time he really understood love, but unfortunately his girlfriend got pregnant. They ended up with an abortion and all this. And it ruined the relationship. That sets the stage for what's happened all across America. Abortion kills not only the baby, many times it kills the mother, and it kills relationships, and it kills the opportunity to love one another. And so...
And just before we go, you'd say about there's a segment of the culture that doesn't want this story told because it thrives on deception, death, individual destruction. Have you gotten pushback on this book?
I'll get pushback on that book. I'm not worried about the pushback. Okay. God says, he tells us, my people perish for lack of knowledge, out of Hosea. That's the apostle, the Hosea initiative. But then he also tells us in Ephesians, have nothing to do with the evil deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. And in the book, it's also a quasi-political story as well, we show the fruit of what happens when you expose it. It unites our culture. And that's what I've lived through. Those things that
are hidden will be revealed, and that's where we're going. Thank you so much for your wonderful book. Terry Beatley, What If We've Been Wrong? I can tell you, we were wrong and he was wrong. Keep My Promise to America's Abortion King. Definitely worth a read. Check it out through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Stay with us. Another bookmark straight ahead. Thank you, Terry. And thank you so much for staying with us. Our part 2 of this program features Father Terrence P. Ehrman, author of Man of God, Lessons for Young Men About Life, Sex, Friendship, Vocation, and Loving with the Heart of Christ, published by our friends at Catholic Answers, available through Religious Catholic, of course. Hey, nice to meet you, Father.
Likewise.
Now, you were on with on Life on the Rock, on that program, talking about this book and your work. Now, you teach at Notre Dame, is that right?
I do. I'm the assistant director for the Center for Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing, and with that comes a teaching position in the theology department.
And this book, Man of God, is kind of a spiritual direction book of sorts. Explain how this came about.
So this book came about, so this is the first full disclosure is that this is narrative fiction. This is like the screw tape letters that Lewis writes to the reader. So I found these letters.
So this guy doesn't really exist, or this?
He's every man, in a sense.
So was there one person you were dealing with when that you're here, or was this multiple people over periods of time, or are these the things you should have written to people if they asked you that question?
Right. So these are letters or emails now that from me to a young college grad. It follows him over the course of a year, more or less.
But you're on the good side of this thing. You're not hanging out with Wormwood and
no, that's
stuff
right.
Like
This is the anti-parallel to the screw tape letters.
Okay, and what made you decide to do something like that?
This book has its origins in a project I did when I was in the seminary at Notre Dame, and my final project was on natural family planning and birth control. I interviewed and surveyed couples, and I always thought I would want to write a book called something like The Taming of Man's Desire. That if you're going to prepare a young man to live the church's teaching on sexual ethics and natural family planning, you just don't do that overnight, right? So how do you form a generation? How do you form the younger generation to become a holy man of God? Right. So that's the ultimate origins for this book.
Is part of the problem people understanding why should I bother being a holy man of God?
I think that we live in a generation that people, I don't think, have a good sense of who they want to be at all. And I think that this book is for how to have this deliberate, intentional plan for your life. How do I live a life in Christ? That it's not just happenstance. You just don't wake up and say, okay, what do I want to do today? But how do you have this intentional deliberate discipleship.
Now, you talk about here, and it's one of the things in dealing with that you focus on, you have a whole litany of different ones, but one of the ones you pick out, you say, I would provide regular long-distance spiritual direction to help him, and this is Joseph, quote unquote, right, with his continuing struggles with chastity. I agreed when we began an email correspondence. Now, is that the major problem for young men today, chastity? And certainly you talk about pornography and iconography, and you have these very individual chapters, but you mentioned that one right up front.
So I think chastity, I think all these other things, pornography, they all fall under that general umbrella of chastity as the virtue that governs how we live this embodied life as men or women.
Now, so when you talk about, and we hear heart speaks to heart, and that comes from Newman, and then Bishop Sheen had a wonderful series of talks given on that as well. What do we mean when we say heart speaks to heart?
I think heart speaks to heart means how do I, as a person, in the depths of my being, how do I encounter another person? So that it's not just, oftentimes when we meet somebody, we don't even look them in the eye, we look at their shoes, or we do something, but it's...
Well, we look at our phone.
We look at our phone, yeah, we're not even looking at that it's, how do you truly have this encounter of the other? And that it's from, I meet you, right? So that's the sense of heart speaks to heart. I think of how Jesus, when he met people, I don't think he was ever distracted when he met you and encountered you.
It's interesting because we live in this kind of highly sensitized society in a lot of ways where everybody is, in a sense, confessing in public in many ways, but at the same time there seems to be an incredible lack of real communication. How do those things come together?
Do they? Yeah, so I think there's this polarity of, we've got all this technology nowadays, then that we become less able to communicate with people. And I think it's, or as you were saying, that people can tell their dirtiest, darkest secrets without any kind of shame. And I think it's because of the impersonal nature of all this. Right? You're not going to see these people again. You're not going to share that at the office or with people that you've met, and you're going to see them again. So I think that might be some of that with the personal nature of things.
Right. Now you deal with students, and obviously you deal with other things like different topics here, and you relate to things. It's interesting, like Heart to Heart, you talk about the Feast of the Sacred Heart. Chapter 2, Protecting Your Garden, Our Lady of Mount Carmel. What does gardening have to do with chastity or living your life?
So what I draw upon in that chapter is gardens for a Catholic or any Christian should be something central to our lives, right? Our life begins in the garden. Jesus is buried in the garden, but I draw upon the book of Daniel and the story of Susanna and Daniel, and these two lecherous old judges of Israel are lusting after Susanna and want to sleep with her in her garden where she's bathing in the middle of the day. And so it's about are we going to be like the lecherous old men lusting after and breaking into the garden of another that needs to be protected, or are we going to be like Daniel, the righteous man who defends that garden?
Right.
So that's the sense of this metaphor for the garden being somebody's inner self. What should be protected, what shouldn't be displayed.
Right. One of the chapters you have is surrounding yourself with saints, and I would think certainly in dealing with young people and college students, that's got to be a tough part of the equation, which is finding other people of a like mind. And I'm assuming that many times we hear that young women can't find young men who actually live their Catholic faith, or vice versa, or you need that support system, like you yourself as a religious priest, have the support of your confreres and the Holy Cross Fathers. It's tough for young men who are maybe away at college at a Notre Dame or other schools, where maybe they even have more support because at least it's a Catholic school, to have that ability to surround yourself or realize that you need to pick your friends carefully.
No, very much so. I think we become who our friends are, or we should choose. And it can be hard to find those people, but I think, say like a place like Notre Dame, I'm just amazed. In some ways, I'd like to live my life over in a sense. Like encountering some of these students, it's amazing how mature they are in their faith and how deliberate they are. Now, that's not everybody, but there's a sense of, so I think with anybody, how do we live a life how are we growing in our own personhood? I think of when Andrew and the unnamed disciple in John's Gospel come to Jesus and he says to them, what are you looking for? And I've asked my students that in the first assignment in class, is to write the answer to that question, like, what in life are you ultimately looking for? And I had one student say, I've never thought of this question before. I thought, you've never thought of that question before? I think of this question every day of my life. Who do you want to be And then how do you surround yourself around with those people to help you become the person that you're called to be? So I think it's how do we live an examined life? I mean, it's
And that's the question. How does one figure out who you're called to be?
right. So this is right. So hopefully you're going to hopefully get this in a family that you'll be taught to examine yourself and to ask these questions.
But is that part of the problem because of the breakdown in the family as well?
I think that'll be part of it. I think it's also there's just so many distractions. I think I was going to say prayer is the main way we find that out, but somebody has to teach us how to pray.
And people have to have the ability to listen.
Right. And so I think just this culture where everything is the electronic media, the social media, you can be pulled in so many different directions that you're not listening and taking that time and silence and solitude.
And do we also sometimes use that as an excuse? I mean, in a sense, it's easier sometimes to allow ourselves to be distracted than to focus on something that maybe we know we need to deal with.
Yeah, or it's just the sadness of the unexamined life, or the sadness of what your life could be, right? To get to the end and say, oh, who could I have been, right? I think that's a great sadness.
The road not taken.
And part of this book is this book is two parts. It's for the person who struggles with chastity and pornography, but it's also for the older generation whose responsibility is to form the younger generation, to have a plan.
What does St. John Damascene have to do with pornography?
Oh, fantastic. That's one of my favorite chapters. And most people don't even know St. John Damascene. I was able to preach at Notre Dame on that feast day, and people say, I've never heard of him. So he's a 8th century saint. He dealt with the iconoclast controversy, which was where the emperor of Constantinople had declared that images were idolatrous, and people were removing them from churches and destroying them.
Fundamentalist Protestant almost position.
Yeah, but you can see some of this in the Protestant. You can't have any images.
Right, exactly. Great.
It offends the third commandment or the second commandment. And so I think with iconography, you encounter the person whom you're venerating. You're not worshiping a piece of wood or metal. You're encountering the one whom you're praying to. In pornography, it's not that. The other person never arrives. Now, also, John Damascene occurs in Advent, and so we're awaiting the arrival of Christ. And so pornography, I think, is ever anti-Advent. That person never arrives. Or you just have some image in your mind of who this person is. You don't want to encounter the real person.
Well, also in pornography, effectively, at least initially, gives one a sense of total control, and then ultimately they lose control.
Right. It's part of real relationships is the vulnerability of how do I respond to this person? I got to give something of myself, right? In pornography,
the whole self-donation
you're totally in control,
thing of John
right?
Paul II, and the
gift of self,
right.
Right. We don't want to meet that person in reality. That's the pornography person, right? They're going to make some demand upon. Oh, this person is a real person that has a family and has a.
Right. I don't want to risk that.
Right.
I don't want to be ultimately really vulnerable.
Right, and so I think to be in love is, as you say, to be vulnerable, which comes from the Latin, right? A wound, right? We can be wounded.
Chapter 10, you deal with cohabitation. I'm assuming that has been a major thing that goes on today. I mean, in the sense of young students.
It's just
I don't
expected.
think they just don't even think about it anymore.
Yeah, it's so much change from when I was growing up that, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes Doug and a baby carriage.
Yeah, right.
And now it's who knows what it is now, right? It's not that. Right. There's this progression of getting to know someone and that I guess just the pretending of to be married, right? This simulation of marriage that takes place without the lifelong commitment.
Right. Right, and statistically, it has shown that doesn't necessarily make it better at all.
Right, I think usually the statistics are that it's worse.
It goes the other way, right. Well, again, but is that also in dealing with, you talk about virginity life and the spirit courtship here, but in dealing with young students, the whole idea of commitment and the issue of commitment. I'm sure you see that even from the religious life of people's fear that I'm making this lifelong commitment and fear of commitment. Do you see that?
Sure, no, it's... yes, it's. I'm not sure where it originates from, or if it's from a culture of where 50% of marriages end in divorce, and not seeing that, or people that don't want to enter into a relationship they don't want to have with what happened to their parents, or that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think there's how to be able to give yourself to another, as we were just talking about before, forever.
Right.
That's. I don't know if people are formed in the level of personhood to be able to say this is a person whom I can give myself to, or whom I can accept.
Right. Well, is there a sense also in dealing with young men and people like this lack of permanence? They don't see the same kind of permanence that maybe because of the way the world is viewed. It moves so quickly. People live longer. People change jobs all the time. They change relationships all the time. Things are highly reusable, or, you know, if it doesn't work anymore, you get rid of it and get a new one.
No, I think that all plays into it. And I also, it's a vicious cycle, because you get more into the social media, and I just see this in class where it's hard for people to interact with one another, right? It's to tell somebody that I disagree with you in person, versus you're doing that in a social media where you're invisible and you don't have a face. And so I think all these things just don't go hand in hand. And so this book is how to learn habits of prayer, how to become a person of integrity, how to encounter the person of, or the three persons of the Trinity, and how that forms you.
How to become a man of God. Right?
Very
good. Well, thank you so much, Father. We're out of time. Thank you for joining us. And our author has been Father Terrence P. Ehrman, author of Man of God, Lessons for Young Men About Life, Sex, Friendship, Vocation, and Loving with the Heart of Christ. A lot of topics available through our religious catalog, as was our first book and author, Terry Beatley's book, What If We've Been Wrong? Keeping My Promise to America's Abortion King, both available through the EWTN religious catalog. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark. Thanks for joining.